I really like Mega Man X3. Too much, according to people who favor X2. Even I have to question it since this game is pretty darn mean. While I'm for challenge, especially in platformers, there is a difference between that and cruelty, which I could see some describing the jump in difficulty between this and the previous. Still though, despite the difficulty curve, during my latest few runs to collect the last of the Hunter medals, I really can't think of any points where I was having a bad time, and despite how similar this is to many of the other X titles, the few things it does different is enough to put it over most of them for me. With that said, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and I'm happy to finally talk about why X3 was third on my list for the X series, which might have upset a few people. Still over 90% likes though. The story for this one might be the most basic of any Mega Man X game. There's a Maverick rebellion being led by a guy named Dr. Doppler, a Reploid that was previously an ally, so X and Zero are dispatched to stop him. Along the way, they find out that Sigma was pulling the strings the whole time, which is probably the most surprising thing about the plot. Not that it was Sigma, but that everyone seems surprised that it was Sigma. I figured they would just assume, but then again, I've been playing these games for a long time, and Sigma had just started using the Patsy system, a la Dr. Wily, so hey, maybe I can cut them some slack for this one. The game looks nice, at least in my opinion. It could be nostalgia talking, but I happen to like how the Super NES X games look, and while a few assets might be reused from the previous games, I say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There are two versions of the game as well, the SNES one and the one for Nintendo's disc-based competition. There's two main differences between them. The first is soundtrack. While both have the same songs, the disc copies have reworked tracks to take advantage of the more impressive hardware. I wouldn't rate one version of the OST over another personally. The upscaled tracks sound really good, and while it might be nostalgia talking again, I like how the original Super Nintendo tracks sound just as much. Guess it just goes to show that Mega Man, in general, has really good music. The only other difference has to do with the intro cutscenes. On the Super Nintendo, when you sit on the start screen, you'll get a basic recap of the in-game situation and what the threat is this time, using in-game assets. When you select a boss, you get the standard reveal and jingle. And on PlayStation and its contemporaries, you get anime. The game's intro plays like a 90s anime opening, complete with a Japanese track on its country of origin and a different vocalist version everywhere else. When you pick a boss, you get a short 15-20 second scene giving a more candid look at what the Maverick is capable of. Despite my love of Nintendo consoles, I kinda have to give it to its competition on this one. I would still recommend giving both a spin though to experience both soundtracks. I'd say play the disc version first, then swap to the SNES version for following runs, before the novelty of the 90s anime wears off. Of course, being able to give both a try is the problem though. I'm fortunate enough to have both. On the X collection for GameCube, they use the enhanced port, and on the latest compilation, the X Legacy collection for modern consoles, they use the original Super Nintendo. With all but that being out of print, your chances to try out the PlayStation and Sega Saturn are limited, but I'm sure a lot of people are clever enough to figure out a solution. At the very least, YouTube exists, and I know people have the OSTs and anime scenes up on there somewhere. You primarily play as X in this game. He starts out with a charge shot and ground dash, though, as usual, by getting armor parts, you greatly increase what he can do. You also get a bonus power-up, chips, which further enhance each part, though you can only have one at once, you being able to swap them out if you find another pink capsule. The boots once again grant an air dash, including a vertical one. This is huge, but if you're using it to dash upwards, there is a bit of a delay, so you have to time it a bit more carefully, if you're using it to dodge. The leg chip grants you a second mid-air dash, which can destroy some platforming sections. For the body, you get armor that increases your defense, as well as gives you a barrier for a few seconds after you get hit to further decrease how much damage you take. The chip further improves your post-damage shield. The helmet shows you the layout of a level when you enter it, highlighting where upgrades are. Given that there's some pretty strange power-up placement in this one, it's kinda helpful initially, but as you learn and memorize where everything is, it can get a bit annoying. If you get the chip though, this lets you regenerate health over time as you stand still, including sub-tanks. While this does require a bit of a time investment, X3 isn't the most generous with drops, so this really helps out. The arm parts give you a bigger charge shot and lets you power up special weapons. I'm not the biggest fan of this one. Throwing out a full charge while on the ground will fire one big shot with two smaller shots on either side of it. My issue is twofold. First, to fire the big boy, you have to stand still for a second, which leaves you pretty vulnerable. Second, putting 5 shots on the screen really puts a strain on the console, which can cause slowdown. Combine that with most of the charge specials not really being all that helpful except in very specific instances, and I'd probably skip this upgrade if I didn't need it to collect some of the other power-ups. The arm chip lets you store charge shots, giving it its own ammo bar. It's a neat idea, but I constantly forget about it. Overall, the third armor isn't bad. It's got some cool stuff, some okay stuff, some stuff I could do without. What really makes it great are the chips, the leg chip being really good from moment to moment, and the head chip being good for the long haul, making it very hard to choose. Luckily, despite what I said, there is a way to get them all. If you get all the regular power-ups, don't touch any of the chips, find the secret hole in the Doppler stages, and are a really good boy, you can get the Hyper Chip, this game's secret that grants you the powers of all 4 chips while turning X gold. A little tacky, but hey, it gets the point across. To get all the Hunter medals, though, you do need to do a run without it, and I went with the leg chip on that run, because it helps me significantly cut down on the damage I take, lessening the need for the head chip, but that one is a very close second. Those aren't the only upgrades, though. As always, each stage has a heart tank to increase your HP, and like the previous 2 titles, you can collect up to 4 refillable sub-tanks, which can refill your health. And then there are ride armors. While this is nothing new, ride armor was around since the original X, the way they work here is different. You find modules for the 4 different types and can summon them from a specific type of platform, which gives you an edge for some short sections. The Chimera punches. The Kangaroo punches but with spiked hands. The Hulk can shoot and fly a bit. And the Frog can hop, function underwater, and fire homing missiles. The idea behind them is neat, you having a selection and the game encouraging you to learn the ins and outs of both them and the levels to choose the right armor for the right situation, but at the same time, they tend to be so short and so far and few between that collecting them feels more like checking an item off a list than actually doing something worthwhile. While I'd rather have this system than not, what I'd really prefer is the way they worked in the past. You just finding the right armors where the game places them and then using them when you got them. And there's one more upgrade. Well, kind of. For the first time, Zero is playable. He has an extended life bar and one more level of Buster Charge, where, after he uses his shots, he'll swing his sword, sending out a shockwave, like that one popular anime trope. X can swap out with him when he needs help, but it is limited. He can't summon him during a boss fight, and Zero only has 1 life, sitting out the rest of the game for repairs if he falls. And if you use him to take out a certain sub-boss, it'll take Zero down too, but in the process, Zero grants X a sword for the rest of the game, which does a ton of damage, so it's probably worth the trade. I love that they finally made the guy playable, but given how little you get to use him and that he doesn't have access to the suite of moves he has in subsequent games, I really don't tend to use him too much, outside of the intro stage and when trying to get his sword. Outside of aforementioned sword though, he really doesn't play any different from X, though that could have been due to hardware limitations. Maybe that's why, outside of the extreme games, we really didn't see too much of this series on Nintendo consoles after this game. Still, given how great he plays in the next game, X4, that they tested the waters out and opened the door for him in the following games makes his inclusion a great addition and justify it as more than just a gimmick. As usual, the level design is on point. I have a ton of fun running through them, there's a lot of tricks to learn, and the power-ups are all hidden in interesting, if sometimes a bit strange, locations. The game does lose a few points for some stages feeling like they have some overlap though, and that might play into there being a good bit of recurrence in boss designs as well. The 2 insects, Gravity Beetle and Blast Hornet, have levels with airbase and supply depot elements. The large mammals, Tunnel Rhino and Neon Tiger, both have enclosed, underground parts of their levels. And there were 3 sea critters this time, Toxic Seahorse, Bolt Catfish, and Crushed Crawfish. I'm not sure why there's so many similarities in the roster this time, but hey, it's still fun and that's the important thing. Just a little weird is all. The bosses themselves have cool designs and are the standard mix of some pushovers, some hard, and some just right. Some also have a super move where they glow and flash, then use it. Some you can knock out of it with the right move, others you just need to dodge. There doesn't seem to be a codified rule for how these work, but I like that they were experimenting and none are so unbalanced that they break the game. Though Neon Tiger using his 3 times in a row after refusing to take damage for several of my shots is a little annoying, and most of them aren't a problem if you have their weakness. While you can't stun lock any of them, you can get pretty close for many. While I'm not sure if their weakness eliminates iframes or if the developers just made it so that they end at the perfect time, you can typically hit the boss again right before they attack, and for most regular bosses, this also interrupts whatever they're doing, making it so that with the right weapon, they won't get many words in edgewise. Then there are the special bosses, Doppler's Enforcers, Bit and Bite, as well as Vile. After you clear 2 stages, they'll be sent out. Sometime in the next few stages, Bit will start interrupting you in certain special rooms and you'll have to beat him to advance. Then several stages after that, it'll be Bite's turn. Vile, on the other hand, you fight by finding a secret capsule that takes you to a special stage. These bosses can come back to face you in the Doppler stages, but if you manage to beat them during the main game with their weakness, they'll die for good and you'll fight an alternate boss. For Bit and Bite, you need to kill both of them, otherwise you'll face their combined form. I guess they use spare parts. God Car Machine Onari. Yes, that's its real name. You take them both out though, you face an elephant-looking waste disposal machine. I'd say both are around the same kind of tough. God Car Machine being a quick fight where you try to outdamage each other, whereas the elephant is more drawn out, with a lot of moving parts making it hard to dodge everything. Likewise, both Vile and his replacement, a squid robot, are both oddly easy for that point in the game. In Vile's case, the fight takes a bit longer since it has 2 parts, whereas the Mechanaloid is just a matter of how quickly you can hit it with the Tri-Thunder. While I would expect the replacement fight to be easier as a reward for killing the regular boss and killing them right earlier, I don't hate this way of doing things. There's pros and cons to each encounter, making the player have to consider what sort of fight they're better equipped for, or just in the mood for. It's a neat dynamic and another strong point for the game. So that all sounds pretty standard, right? While there are some elements unique to this game, none of it seems too far out of left field, so why is this one typically considered one of the harder entries? Well, it's no single thing, but a collection of small tweaks to the formula. The big things are the enemies. While in most other X games, where it seems like around 70% of regular stage enemies can be downed with a charge or even partially charged shot, here that seems flipped on its head, with probably less than 30% going down with a single strike. Rather than just being able to get by just holding the button and firing when appropriate, now you have to be much more cautious when you engage and approach carefully. In addition to that, enemies also seem to either be more aggressive or hit a bit harder, or possibly both, making this the most I've ever used my sub-tanks and lusted after the armor. And speaking of power-ups, some are in really unintuitive spots and require some very specific powers to get. You get the boots fairly early, but you need to make a tricky jump involving ice. To get the armor, you need both the gravity well and arm parts, which take a while to get. For 2 upgrades in Tunnel Rhino's stage, you need to knock down rocks suspended by ropes. Rather than use the weapon that looks like they could cut, you instead need to charge the electric power to cause an earthquake. While this might be a little more obvious in Japan, where catfish do tie into earthquakes, over here it's a little more obtuse, and even if you tested out what Tri-Thunder does when charged, it'd be pretty easy to confuse the vibrations from it as a visual effect rather than a practical one. And to get any of the ride armors, you first need to get specifically the one in Blast Hornet's basement, making it so that even if you know where the others are, your knowledge is useless until later. Then there's Bit and Bite. Both are kinda tough, Bit being pretty fast while throwing out projectiles that will either hold you in place or track you, giving you something else to avoid. Bite is pretty easy if you have the boots and get in a rhythm, but if you can't, he'll pretty much just throttle you over and over again. Unlike the X-Hunters, who were completely optional until the final stages, these 2 are mandatory and can easily stonewall you if you don't get the right combination of power-ups and skill level before they pop up. And may I just say that, in general, this game's Sigma is one of, if not the, hardest in any of the X titles. Then there's the slight bugs that I seem to encounter. While I don't recall this on the GameCube compilation, the Legacy Collections just port the games as is, unoptimized, with this being the Super Nintendo version of X3 at that. There were two levels, the intro and the first Doppler stage, where the game would sometimes not take my inputs. When I streamed this game months ago, I was using a new controller, so I blame that, and I do think that was in part it, since it gave me trouble in Smash as well. This time though, while I don't think I was using the best controller in the world, it was good enough that I was able to get through most of the other games in the collection without hiccups, so I kinda have to blame the game, at least this port of it. While the intro stage sometimes not reading my jump just happened on one run, so maybe that it was something loading incorrectly, the Doppler stage has been an issue every time. Like I said though, this is the SNES version of the game, which isn't as strong of a console as those with the disc drive that got it. When I'm running through a section where X is on screen, holding a charge shot that can fire 5 blasts, with 1 or 2 enemies in play that can fire up to 2 missiles at once, and there are sections of ceiling that will also fall if I get close, I can kind of understand the game getting distracted and not realizing that I hit the dash button in the air. It's yet another possible reason why we didn't really see the X series on a Nintendo console after this. I did manage to mitigate this a bit on my last run by being a bit more mindful of my jumps and not charging my buster but instead rapid firing through enemies, but it is still an issue that makes things a bit harder, unintentionally so. When it comes to X3, it feels like Capcom looked back at the previous 2 games and decided that players were ready for a challenge. Other than the one bug I mentioned, everything else seems like a conscious choice, and you know what? I'm here for it. I really like it when a series bakes in a difficulty curve into its sequels, and X3 seems like the culmination of this. Whether they wanted to concentrate on trying new things with the stronger hardware going forward, or just wanted to cap off the Super Nintendo trilogy with something challenging, X3 is, in my opinion, the hardest of the X games. At least without crossing into bogus territory. Probably talk about that in several weeks. While it is hard, it doesn't feel unfair, and I think most veterans of the series should be able to get through it with some practice and the right combination of upgrades. And yes, while how to get some of these is somewhat unintuitive, we live in the internet age, so the solutions are in reach if you can put aside your pride. All that said, I would not recommend this as an entry point for any player. If you can't beat X or X2, then you'll almost certainly not be able to beat X3. If you do put in the work though, and do manage to get good enough to beat X3, it is immensely satisfying. I was actually a little nervous to come back to this one, because I remember it being pretty hard back when I started replaying these games, getting stuck on some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, even needing to take a break from the game when I got to Sigma. After all the Mega Man I've been playing though, I managed to get through it without any major issues. I even did things in a crazy order after watching a video laying out the optimal order to collect everything, adding a bit of extra spice to my playthrough. Seriously, the video I saw was amazing. It was by a channel called Jay's Reviews, and if you can pull it off, you only need to revisit a level once. And that Sigma fight that I had so much trouble with before, beat it without the hyper chip using only 2 sub-tanks. To sum it up, while there's a few things that set X3 apart, the biggest example being the chips, for the most part, it feels very similar to the 2 games that came before, just harder. Because of this, it's the clearest indicator of how much I've improved and is perhaps the most satisfying to clear. When I was putting my thoughts together on the games a few weeks back, X3 was actually one of the games I had played the least, so I was worried I was romanticizing it a bit. But replaying it again now, I have to say I really do love this game and still would put it in the top 3 for the series. But hey, that's just my take on it. What about you? Are you a fan? Do you think it's overrated? Have you ever beaten it? Or maybe you've never played it but you're thinking about giving it a try now? Am I overselling its difficulty in comparison to the rest of the games? I'm always up for a bit of discourse when it comes to Mega Man, but for right now, thanks for watching, maybe subscribe if you enjoyed this video and like Mega Man content, and perhaps I'll see you in the next one.